Today we are delighted to hear from Sarah Bracke, who is visiting with us from the University of Ghent, where she is an associate professor of sociology. Her work is situated at the intersection of gender, sexuality, religion, and culture, and draws on critical theory, both from feminist and post-colonial theory. Her PhD is in women's studies from the University of Utrecht, and her doctoral work investigated the question of female religious agency in the context of Christian and Islamic movements in Europe. After her doctorate, she received the prestigious Marie Curie Fellowship, which she used to come to the United States, and where she began work with Judith Butler as a visiting fellow in the critical theory program at UC Berkeley. I think that Sarah's work is really important in moving forward the discussions about agency that Saba Mahmood has brought so much to the fore, as well as other scholars, by working in both Christianity and Islam together in the context of Europe. We're really, I think, going to learn a lot more about the issues that have become so salient in our discussions of post-secularity and post-colonialism in a religious context. So without further ado, I will let Sarah present her lecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. It's really such a pleasure to be here in the Women's Studies in Religion program. So I really want to thank you and my colleague, research associates, and Tracy. This really is a precious place in terms of intellectual exchange and generosity and engagement. And and I keep on being surprised. Today, Tracy actually provided us with Belgian beer and Belgian chocolate on this occasion. So it's just amazing. Thank you. In the spring of 2000, I lived in Milan in a shared house with 7 female students who belonged to the Catholic Renewal movement Comunione e Liberazione. The abbreviation is CL, which I will use. My life followed the rhythm and the encounters of theirs as I was researching the question of female religious agency. And during one of many warm evenings spent together with meals, guests, and laughter, I met Marta. Marta had come to the house as a guest, and she was slightly older than most of the students in the house. She was intrigued by my presence and by the fact that I was studying the movement she belonged to. She questioned me about the research project and insisted that we create the time and space for her to narrate the story of her journey into her faith. So we set up an interview. Beyond her desire to share her own story, there also clearly was a more general concern whether my social scientific frameworks would actually capture what she knew to be true about her faith. Now, Marta was not alone with her concerns about the theoretical frameworks and concepts of the research project. I shared some of them. The ethnographic work with GL in 2000 was part of a larger project on female piety within movements seeking to counter processes of secularization, both within Christian and Islamic traditions in Europe. To a significant extent, this project was prompted by what Helen Hardecker, and this is in the Fundamentalism Project, calls the why question. Why do women become such, and I quote here, why do women become such staunch advocates of fundamentalist creeds when those same creeds seem to deepen their subordination to men and require them to relinquish power and authority to men? End of quote. Now, this is perhaps the most difficult question about what she calls fundamentalism and gender, and I will just put a little footnote here. I won't elaborate that I don't really work with the term fundamentalism. I don't think that analytically that's an interesting term. But Hardecker argues that the predicament of a significant involvement of women in religious movement that sanction gender arrangement that seems to go against women's interests has been a vexing, theoretically vexing and politically perplexing question. This is how Valentine Moghadam puts it, or it has been a paradox, and this is how Gita Sagal and Nira Yuval Davis put it, a paradox that remains difficult to account for. Moreover, this project was also part of what we can understand as a turn to agency in the scholarship on women and religious movements that sit uncomfortably with secular liberal understandings of acceptable forms of religiosity. Within this turn to agency, the paradox is addressed through the exploration of women's narratives. In many ways, these narratives cause friction with or even break out of established feminist and sociological frameworks and imaginations, such as notions of women's interest, notions of agency. And taken seriously, these narratives pose critical challenges to our conceptual frameworks, as the work of Saba Mahmoud so strikingly shows. In this context, I found the initial why question not to do the work that I wanted it to do or that I thought was needed, as it tends to keep the framework and a set of assumptions in place which position female piety as something that needs to be explained as this strange thing. Instead, another question emerged which focused on how. So the shift from why to how, a shift which can be understood in Foucauldian terms. In Subject and Power, Foucault indeed suggests that asking how might be more productive than asking why within the exploration of different ways in which human beings are made into subjects. So how do female and pious subjectivities come into being at the dawn of the 21st century in a secular or a post-secular Europe? My interest in this question lies both in seeking to better understand particular processes of subjectivation, but also in engaging the limits of social scientific imaginaries of agency and subjectivity. Marta's concern with how to think about female pious subjects as herself was expressed in a very different manner. On the evening we met at the communal dinner at the Ciel apartment, she asked me this: have you been looking into the power of the saints? If you want to understand something about women and religion, and in particular if you want to grasp why women are attracted to Ciel, you must look at the importance of saints. End of quote. Now, her words represented one of the many little instances of displacement within the research project. For various reasons, saints had not been part of the research frame until then. Ciel was not or is not a movement with a significant veneration of saints, and sociology is not a discipline that has proven to be particularly equipped for the study of saints. Then Michel de Certeau, whose scholarship escapes disciplinary grip, yet he certainly is no stranger to sociology, when he delineated in his study of the mystic, La Fable Mystique, when he delineated the area of study, he proposed 4 areas of inquiry, 4 sides of a frame, as he puts it. And he turned to the study of eroticism, psychoanalytical theory, historiography, and the fable. But it still remains unclear what a sociology of saints or a sociology of the mystic would look like. Yet Marta's insistence on the saints, on female saints in particular, did resonate with a tradition of feminist attention to saints, to which I will return shortly. In this talk today, I will engage the subject of saints embedded within the ethnographic case study of Comunione e Liberazione, and I will look at how female pious subjectivities come into being. And I do so with the aim of, as actually I already mentioned, with the aim of attending to processes of subjectivation that are often misrecognized, as well as to critically engaged sociological concepts and notably agency, which actually produce this misrecognition. But before going into the argument, a brief presentation of Comunione e Liberazione is in order. So Ciel came out of the Milan-based experience of a Catholic youth movement which emerged in the 1950s under the leadership or the charisma of the chaplain Luigi Giussani. Now, Don Giussani had been teaching theology at a theology faculty, but after a train journey in which he met a bunch of young people whom he found terribly ignorant about the Catholic Church, he demanded to be transferred to a high school in order to devote himself to what he calls, and I quote, the reconstruction of the Christian presence among students. And maybe I will skip for the sake of time one of the foundational anecdotes that figure in Giussani's account of how this, the birth of the movement came about, is really one that focuses on how other students in the college or in the lycée were able to speak in terms of we communists, we fascists, actually, this is post-fascist Italy, but there was no we Christians, and how he tried to create that sense of we Christians, we Catholics. Okay, so Italy of the 1950s is usually regarded as a deeply Catholic society. As Robert Lumley points out, the Catholic Church in post-war and in post-fascist Italy had to defend itself from three main threats: Marxism, demands for the ending of the Concordat, which regulated church-state relationships and came into being under a fascist regime of Mussolini, and the secularization of society. And in fact, the church defended itself on these three levels with remarkable success. The Concordat was renewed, a full-scale mobilization of the faithful in the parishes took place in the 1950s, and the Italian Catholic Party, the Communist Party, sorry, the Italian Communist Party, was isolated, with communist voters being under the threat of excommunication. But Giussani was invested in a different genealogy in which the Catholic character of Italian society at the time represented what he called merely a facade, resting on a formal aspect of laws and habits in which people did not believe anymore, and the belief which they would subsequently leave behind. So a facade behind which what he calls a radicalization of secular culture was taking place. In Giussani's view, faith was increasingly reduced to moralism, and while young people might still profess to be Catholic and be able to recite the creed, it did not influence the way in which they made their judgments and decisions about the world they lived in. So Giussani was invested in developing a counter-secularization project. A focus on Marxism might actually have had a wider resonance in a period of Cold War and post-fascist Italy, but despite Giussani's real preoccupations with Marxism, he located the problem elsewhere, a problem shared to Marxism but also to liberalism, and a problem which he named was Enlightenment culture. And what was needed, according to Giussani, was a development of an educational method, tools and instruments, methodologies that would counter the effect of a dualist worldview based on the separation of the spiritual and worldly realms, and that would transform the relationship between modern society and religion, and thus offering an alternative to secular culture. So this is just to situate a bit where Comunione e Liberazione comes from. Again, I'm going to skip a little bit, but just mention two conflicts that, or two events that have really shaped what the movement became, often in conflict. First of all, the Second Vatican Council, which took place from 62 till 65, and then the student revolts of the 1960s and 68. And with both of these events, the movement had an interesting and a difficult relationship, a conflict relationship, but also a relationship of trying to reclaim them, to represent the true spirit of the Vatican Council and to represent the true Enlightenment critique, so going beyond the student revolts and the Vatican Council. Okay, so back to the story of Marta. Marta's story of coming to the movement was all but exceptional. Marta was born at the end of the 1970s. She was baptized as an infant within the Catholic Church. Her father was a cultural Catholic who at some point took distance from the church, and her mother used to be more pious, or more pious than her father, but gradually stopped practicing her faith. Growing up in the north of Italy near the Swiss border, Marta attended youth activities in her parish, like most of her other friends at school would, and she received the sacrament of confirmation at the age of 12, and shortly after that, she simply stopped going to the church. When she was 16, she attended a CL summer camp, more or less by coincidence, although there are no coincidences, okay. And that is where her involvement with the movement began. Or as she would put it, that is where I truly encountered Christ. When shortly afterwards she went to the university in Milan, and Milan is where CL is particularly strongly embedded, she effectively entered a CL universe, living in CL apartments, being part of the CL student movement, and so forth. I met Marta when she had just graduated in architecture. She felt herself to be at a crossroads in her life, as she had come to understand, within the context of CL, that there are two and only two possible life shapes or life forms, as she put it. And I quote, "Thank God there are two paths, and thank God that others do not exist. There are no other possibilities." And it was not yet clear what her path would be. One of these paths might take her to establish a family, and the other one might lead her to a consecrated celibate life. And perhaps at this point I will also just mention that the project that I'm engaged in at this moment and the book that I'm writing here in the Women's Studies program actually is going back to this older field work and doing interviews again with all of these respondents. I haven't done one with Marta yet, but I would be very curious to know which of the two paths she has taken. So it's very exciting to go back to, more than 10 years later, to go back to these respondents and continue conversations. So within CL, there is a lay consecrated life form with a great following called Memoris Domini, which is understood as a form of life where, and I quote, life and body are activated as memory of Christ. Memoris Domini take a number of vows, including the vows of chastity and poverty, and they live together in same-sex small communities, sharing a communal life structured by prayers and hours of silence, while continuing a full-time professional life in the world outside. As such, this life form combines contemplative and monastical elements together with an active being in the world, and it expresses very much the mystical dimension of Comunione e Liberazione. Now, from her first encounters with CL, Marta was strongly attracted by this consecrated life and its mystical dimension, and one of the ways in which she spoke about that attraction is the following, and I quote, "Another thing that is important to me and that has always fascinated me, as I told you before, are the figures of the saints, because the saint is the real human being." End of quote. Now, what did Marta mean by real? In her own life story, real stood in contrast with what she considered to be the fake world of her secular, cultural Catholic upbringing before she met the movement. She qualified the world of her family and her school as non-authentic. She also qualified it as bourgeois. This world had not been devoid of various kinds of religious attachments and practices, especially through the figure of her mother. But through the experience of CL, Marta had come to feel that kind of religiosity as empty, as not touching upon what matters. Saints, in contrast, directed Marta to where a relationship with the divine mattered, where it touched her and where it touched reality. Now, this reference to what is real also points very strongly to CL's theology. Realism is the first premise of Giussani's theology, as it is laid out in his book entitled The Religious Sense, which is a book that all members of CL read and reread in a practice which they call Scuola di Comunità, the community school, which is a weekly practice. Now, realism here means, and I quote Giussani, "the urgent necessity not to give a more important role to a scheme already in our minds, but rather to cultivate an entire, passionate, insistent ability to observe the real event, the fact." End of quote. Giussani's understanding of realism deserves a more elaborate and critical discussion than I can present you today, but I invoke it here to further situate Marta's qualification of the reality of saints. To Marta, saints are both touched by and touch upon what really matters, which at the same time implies that they remain unaffected and untouched by the superfluous. Yet by what precisely do they remain untouched? Not by experience, as it is through experience, and often various kinds of tribulations, that the story of their holiness develops. Moreover, Chiel's theological framework strongly relies on the notion of the religious experience, in which Giussani suggests that experience is the method par excellence to begin knowing the reality of an event, and this actually proposes existential inquiry as his realist method. Nor is this reality unaffected by feeling. Saints go through feelings of passions and pain, insanity and exuberant joy, and also the notion of feeling is important in relation to the experience and the reason within, which are central within the theological framework of the movement. And I quote Giussani again, "There is nothing that enters our sphere of knowledge, and therefore our experience," he argues, "that does not provoke, stir up, solicit, determine, and thus establish within us a certain state of the soul. And this state of the soul is what he calls feeling." So while experience and feeling are crucial to this understanding of reality, what seems to fall outside the notion of reality, and perhaps even functions as its constitutive outside, is the body. The body figures quite centrally in life stories of saints, and in particular female saints. It is the crucial antagonist in the story of holiness. It often serves as the battleground in which holiness is challenged or established, and starving, torture, and pain are endured. Thus, arguably, the reality by which the saints remain ultimately untouched is the reality of the body. Giussani's theology relies on a dualist relation between body and soul. The I knows itself as being made up of two different realities, matter and spirit, body and soul, that are not reducible to each other, he argues. On the one hand, there is the measurable reality, which is material. On the other hand, there are the I elements, which are not identifiable with the measurable, like ideas, judgments, and decisions. These are indivisible, and what is more, argues Giussani, death does not touch upon them. And now I quote him again, "Death does not touch the reality in me, which is not divisible, nor measurable, nor essentially mutable. Death is not applicable to me." So not only is the self composed of two realities, the real self, the reality of humanity, is equated with one of those, the reality of the spirit, of the soul, which I'm kind of going very compact through a much longer reasoning in Giussani's book, but which leads him to conclude that section with, "I am not my body." Now, as spirit or mind or soul are equated with identity, with who I am, with solidity, the body is considered something extremely volatile, to borrow Elizabeth Gross' expression. The body becomes something the mind must expel in order to retain its integrity. It is implicitly defined as unruly, disruptive, in need of direction and judgment, merely incidental to the defining characteristics of mind, reason, or personal identity. And such an attitude towards the body and towards understanding oneself in terms of soul and spirit traversed many, or I should say all, of my interlocutors, their narratives of self. Now, this understanding of the self in terms of spirit-soul goes hand in hand with an understanding of the self and of humanity, real humanity, beyond sexual difference, and the idea of a soul beyond sexual difference. At this point, we might argue that a certain transcendence of the body is particularly attractive to women. And indeed, this way of understanding sexual difference in relation to the question of transcendence and immanence has been argued before, notably within feminist thinking on saints and mystics, and notably feminist thinkers who are at least culturally connected somehow to a Catholic worldview. Okay, some of these people are now probably getting upset or turning around in their graves. As Simone de Beauvoir, in her seminal The Deuxième Sexe, where she provides a tour de force in surveying the history, the myths, and the structures of what she calls the situation of women throughout European history, reveals how the subject of women and of femininity is created and invested in continuing women's oppression. Central to de Beauvoir's argument, as we all know, is a suggestion that within a patriarchal gender regime, men are able to realize themselves through transcendence, while women's lot is one of immanence. Beauvoir's analysis suggests that being a woman is inscribed upon the body, which figures the body, her analysis figures the body as a passive medium, and also presents us a subject that is utterly subjected and tied to that body. Unsurprisingly, references to Christianity figure in various places of the 2 volumes of The Second Sex as part of the patriarchal regime that oppresses women, or relatedly, that functions as forms of compensation for this oppression. Yet, amidst de Beauvoir's critique of Christianity, there is an assertion that women can achieve transcendence through their faith, namely in transcending sexual difference altogether, as exemplified by the figure of Teresa of Avila. As Amy Hollywood argues, Beauvoir presents Teresa as an existentialist heroine who is enabled to act through the power of her belief in a God who enables her to be everything. Teresa speaks and acts in ways that indicate an exceptional kind of agency, not available for ordinary women at the time, and in what is considered to be what some authors have commented upon as a viral form of subjectivity, transcending the confines of femininity. Also, Luce Irigaray, I could add the Belgian thinker Luce Irigaray, has argued that historically in the West, female mysticism represents the possibility of women occupying a place of a speaking subject, or even the sole place, and this is paraphrasing a section, La Mystérique, from Speculum, or even the sole place within history of the West where women achieved full and autonomous subjectivity. The female saint or mystic's excessive love for God actually transforms her into him, Irigaray suggests. This is the secret of her exchange, she comments. And in this transformation, as in her jouissance, she comments, she loses all sense of corporeal boundary. She again transcends the body. Yet both de Beauvoir and Irigaray remain ambivalent about women's mysticism. De Beauvoir addresses the power of the mystic in a brief chapter in which is situated in that section of Le Deuxième Sexe that discovers different strategies of women seeking to ameliorate their individual status, but ultimately failing to change the dire situation of women in general, which according to de Beauvoir can only be changed through collective strategy. So the mystic as an individual strategy. As Hollywood puts it, and I quote, de Beauvoir recognizes that mystical experience historically granted some extraordinary women limited forms of authority. Yet for de Beauvoir, mysticism merely serves as a justification for women's political oppression within male-dominant society. And also revisiting her earlier work, Mary Daly argues in her post-Christian introduction that adopting de Beauvoir's model of transcendence within theology is not enough. And I quote, women must learn to set their pride not merely beyond, but also within sexual differentiation. Also, Irigaray is not satisfied with the transcendence that she attributes to female mystics, and in the end, their relative autonomy, she argues, fails to challenge the patriarchal hierarchy of the church. Feminist perspectives on saints and on mystics. Now, going back to Marta. Marta's attachment to the saints might be read in terms of the attraction of transcending the body, of transcending sexual difference, exercised on many women within Chiel. Such a reading should, I believe, connect the theological significance of Giussani's I am not my body to a social logic or a sociology of how sexual difference is shaped within a patriarchal context. And this reading might indeed enable us to understand how particular forms of agency are engendered while others are foreclosed in the context of female piety. But what I want to suggest, however, is that such a reading remains bound by the same limits, by some of the limits of the return to agency, which I mentioned at the outset of this talk, and its insistence on demonstrating the agency of pious women. Such demonstrations easily tend to consider theological language and a reference to the divine as a strategic expression of pious women's own agency, and thus somehow pitting own interest or own agency, and thus affirming the integrity of a subject of her own, pitting that against the relationship to the divine. Now, this insistence of women's agency on women's agency then begs the question how to take seriously the agency of a subject when she is committed to ascribing her own agency to God. And this is a formulation of Hollywood, a dilemma, Amy Hollywood notes, which still remains unresolved. Within the social sciences, Saba Mahmoud's work elaborates this point most insightfully. In Politics of Piety, Mahmoud argues that women's agency, as conventionally understood within classical liberal terms as the realization of one's own interests against the weight of customs, tradition, or transcendental will, that this own agency this notion of agency is informed by a number of assumptions and elisions, and most notably that it is informed by a notion of resistance, which is ascribed to the concept of agency and even taken to be its paradigmatic sign, resistance to patriarchal structures and so forth. Mahmoud offers a reconceptualization of agency as the capacity for action enabled and created, sometimes paradoxically, by historically specific relations of subordination rather than in opposition to them. And this is, of course, a Foucauldian understanding of how the subject works. Now, how can we then understand, in sociological terms, agency as the capacity for action in a context in which the relationship to the divine becomes incarnated in ethical and corporeal practices? I pose this question, of course, against the background of how the conceptualization of the social as an autonomous object of knowledge in the last couple of centuries was premised on positioning religion and the religious as a constitutive other of the social. Now, to begin addressing this question, I looked at those instances in my respondents' narratives where established understandings of agency begin to unravel. In the time that remains, I will zoom in on one dimension of agency, and that is the understanding of the concept of choice, the capacity to choose as being central to established sociological understandings of agency. For instance, notably, look at Anthony Giddens' definition of agency, where choice becomes important. And once more, I will return to Marta. A careful analysis of the transcripts of our interview reveals a subtle but undeniable tension between my use of a vocabulary of choice, me as the interviewer speaking about intentions, preferences, or choices, and her systematic reframing or shifting of my questions. This becomes most clear, and the example I'm going to give here is not an example of a subtle, it's not subtle here. This becomes really unsubtle and clear when I inquired about where she positions herself in relation to the two life forms that she had described, the family or the memoris domini. And in her response, Marta steers away from an understanding of choice. I think I actually asked the question as what will you choose? Very unsubtle. And relies on an understanding of vocation instead. Her problem with the notion of choice in this context became even more explicit when we were talking in another part of the interview about work-life balance. And I quote her here. Yesterday, I was speaking to a colleague of mine who said that the family is a vocation, just like work is, and that one has to choose, either family or work. This horrified me, as if I can choose family as a vocation. Already here, the sentence doesn't work. I choose as a vocation. End of quote. So vocation, Marta suggests, belongs to a different register, a different dimension than choice. One does not choose vocations. One might be able to hear a vocation, to receive it, to discover it, to understand it, either slowly or in a split second, either willingly or unwillingly, but one does not choose it. In other words, while Marta remains invested in her capacity to act, and notably to act upon a vocation and what would be the right way of acting, she understands this capacity to be shaped in concert with the realm of the divine, with another actor involved in this vocation. Moreover, when Marta spoke about the two possible forms that life can take, she insisted that both, despite their differences, were about the same thing. They were about establishing community. The precise expression she used was the following, so I quote, "For you, choice means company. Whether it is a man, a woman, or Christ himself, you do not remain alone," end of quote. Now, Marta emphasized the term choice as if it were in quotation marks. So this is part of the verbal dynamics that came in the interview. Like, for you, choice means company. Here, choice was about a relationship, a deep engagement, which is also the context in which this choosing came about. Choice, in other words, is not only a poor way of talking about vocation for Marta, it also badly conveys the community context in which her capacity to act comes about. And instead, the notion of choice suggests a more individual genesis of these actions. And finally, it is important to note that the capacity to act to which Marta refers is not only relational, so both in relation to the divine and in relation to the community, but has implications on the level of embodiment. The notion of vocation, for instance, requires a particular understanding of the body and the senses. One needs to be able to hear or to see or to feel in particular ways in order to relate to a vocation. The body and the senses need to be wired in a particular way, one could say. Ways that are not necessarily, or not at all probably, recognized as secular. And this underscores the point that established understandings of agency within social sciences rely on what Charles Hirschkind, in a recent essay, has called the secular body. And this highlights the point that particular concepts of agency each come with their own understandings of the body. And this also begs the question, what is the naturalized understanding of the body that underlies these concepts, and kind of a naturalized understanding of the secular body? And by way of conclusion, and to now actually speak a bit to my disciplinary community, which is sociology, in the light of established understandings of agency, which within social sciences use notions of choice, free choice, acting independently, pursuing one's own interest, pursuing one's free will. So in the light of these established notions of agency, the capacity to act, here narrated and represented by Marta, is doomed to found lacking of choice, of free will, and so forth. In a sense, what my project aims to do is to shift this qualification of lack away from the empirical subjects that I have been talking to and working with, to the established sociological frames that position subjects like Marta. If we are dealing with a shortfall here, then it is, I would like to suggest, a lack of sociological imagination. Back in the 1950s, C. Wright Mills defined sociological imagination as the vivid awareness of the relationship between experience and wider society, and suggested that it involves the ability to understand how personal experience, the experience of the I, emerges and is situated at a crossroads of all kinds of structuring social relations. Such an understanding of what sociology is and what it does, I believe, leaves ample space to take seriously the experience of a subject who experiences her I, not as a bounded individual who makes free choices on her own, but understands her capacity to act as emerging within constitutive relationships including a relationship to the divine. Marta, who was the pivotal figure in my talk today, could be considered as an eccentric, well, maybe as well, as an ecstatic subject. A subject that moves out, like ecstatic, like moves out of a liberal secular understanding of the self. A subject who is constituted by a set of relations, including a relation to the divine, and who consistently remembers, and here the figure of the memoris domini come to mind, who remembers that her capacity to act emerges within and is shaped by those relationships. In this sense, there are, of course, many kinds of ecstatic subjectivities, many of them not necessarily religious, and I would also say many religious subjectivities are not necessarily ecstatic, but subjectivities who in different ways stand in tension with ontologies of both identity and individualism, and with other premises of many of the established sociological tools to account for social reality. And the question I want to end this talk with, I will not provide the answer, I will just provide the question, and to read more about the answer, you should probably wait till the book comes out. The question is, what would a sociology of ecstatic subjects look like, and how would it transform sociology as we know it? Thank you.